This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting today's show is K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor with this week's cattle market update. He discusses the market and changes in meat demand. K-State wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato continues the show with information about two recent publications involving wheat that producers might want to consider when deciding which varieties to plant. Rounding out today's show is Joe Gerken, K-State fisheries and aquatics extension specialist, with things people with low or dry ponds should consider. Ponds in these conditions can present opportunities for pond improvement. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update. And this week, we're joined by K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. Glynn, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure, and thanks for having me on, Shelby.
Starting with our cattle market conversation with what are cash cattle markets looking like?
Yeah, this past week, AMS called the 5-area fed cattle market Friday versus prior Friday basically steady, 185. The feeder cattle market was called steady to lower, depending on exactly what weight class we might quote. Most of them in Kansas, I would say, were steady. Dodge City, two of the larger volume lots, I always like to bring to kind of reference here, is one lot of 102 head weighing 728, went for 251. Heavier lot, 294 head weighing 820, went for 241. Both of those have been roughly on par, maybe $1 back from the week before. On the board, so CME contracts, live cattle, August was 181, up almost $2 from the prior Friday. And then August feeder cattle is 248, up almost $3. So to put a summary on that was, basically steady. There's a couple of cases of up. There's definitely some supply side support. Cattle on feed report got broke down in the last series and so forth. Not major surprises in my perspective there, but just reiterating the number of hooves in the system is and will continue to tighten. And we're going to talk demand here in a minute, but it continues to shine the light on the price mover is going to be on the demand side because I think there's growing certainty on the tight cattle supply part of that equation.
And Glenn, before we move on to that demand, what is box beef cutout looking like?
Yeah, so up a little bit this past week. So choice Friday was 318. This is USDA's box beef cutout quotes versus 316 the week before. So it's a $2 improvement in choice beef. Select was 293 on Friday, up almost $5 from the week before. So we are seeing a little bit of a near-term boost there. It would be nice to see there be some additional legs. We are still in grilling season. We're past some of the key holidays, but roughly a year ago, one of your predecessors and I did a long segment on the impact of tailgating and grilling on meat demand and so forth. Putting a shout out to that for people who can pull it up and listen to it. Hopefully K-State's about ready to go on a, multi-win football streak. And, all our listeners, we have a purple bias group, but more generally college football, high school football, so forth is getting ready to kick off. To the extent that boost, interest in grilling, that's worth watching. And we'll see if it pulls those cutout values up with it.
Is that similar to all the historical data of like the ebb and flow of the market?
There's seasonal patterns, like grilling is fairly seasonal. I don't want to get into weather arguments about if it goes on longer in the year than others and so forth. But the part that is atypical this year is, the sort of post-pandemic meat demand effects, and certainly the post-pandemic and the cattle cycle and the drought-induced supply side of this. Both of them are fairly unique. So there's a lot of things in 2023 that you can't look for historical precedent on. But when it comes to seasonality of grilling, we certainly can look at seasonality from the past.
Moving now on into that meat demand, first mentioning that your August meat demand monitor will be coming out shortly.
Yeah, so tomorrow I anticipate closing data collection on that. Usually about a 3-day lag. This is basically a shout out for listeners that like that. It'll be posted to our AgManager website once it's USDA approved. I suspect we're going to find flat, if not additional, a little bit pullback on domestic meat demand is what I expect we'll see there. But in lieu of that, I brought the latest USDA information, and it is June based. So first, a reminder is the time differences, demand indices that are available again on our AgManager website that come from USDA data are more lagged. They're 6 to 8 weeks after the fact, primarily because we've got to wait for trade data to figure out what state in the country versus what's exported. And then the meat demand monitor, which is survey based, is more contemporary. So keep the time differences in mind here on top of just differences in data collection. But the export story for U.S. meat, the first half of the year, so we have data through June of 23. We've now had 12 consecutive months where export demand for beef has declined compared to the same month the year before. So in June, we were down 6% compared to the prior June. Pork is sort of the opposite story. Pork demand abroad in June was up 21% versus June of 22. That's the 10th consecutive month of year-over-year increases. It's really important to keep in mind beef was in a position of strength in 22 and pork was in a position of weakness in 2022. So these year-over-year comparisons reflect that a lot. Chicken export demand is off about 3%, and it's been pretty mixed this year. So kind of a mixed bag for the broader protein story on exports. Domestically, June beef demand was off almost 4% compared to June of 22. All 6 months in 23 have been lower on the domestic demand front for beef per the USDA metric. That said, beef demand has held up better than some of us expected. So you can have a little softer demand and yet it be stronger than expected. Would be the clarifying point there. Pork demand was certainly off about 14% in June compared to June of 22. And only 1 month here in 23, the first 6 months, has pork demand been stronger than the same month the year before. So the red meat categories had some pullback. I think the last 3 or 4 times you've had me on, we've talked about this. I think it's lingering macroeconomic challenges. The average resident's pay is not keeping up with cost of living. Yes, inflation has moderated some, but that general statement still holds. And I think just household finances are being pinched. And that's going to put, I don't like the term ceiling, but it definitely puts pressure on meat demand. Chicken is a mixed bag, down 1% in June of 23 versus June of 22, and mixed throughout the first 6 months of the year.
Do you expect kind of that story to remain throughout the rest of the year?
Yeah, that's the, I used to say $1 million question, but in our inflation world, it becomes the trillion or $1 billion. Everything's more zeros, right? I think that is the key question for the next 6-12 months, on top of what we pulled herd expansion trigger. Those are the 2 biggest things to watch. If inflation continues to moderate, I think there's reasons to be optimistic the worst of the meat demand pull down is behind us. And the reason I say that is there are lots of nuggets in the meat demand monitor to say the public wants meat protein, but it's an affordability kind of question. So it's not a product safety. It's not an image issue. It's whatever. The public has a very favorable view for the most part on beef, pork, and chicken. So they're set up ready to seize an improved macroeconomic environment. And I'm cautiously optimistic that the worst of the inflation is behind us. But history would tell us we don't know until we know, and we're not out of the woods yet. Recent Federal Reserve meetings and so forth would give some caution because there's some other indirect signals that maybe not all prices are going down the way that, the Federal Reserve would like. I don't want to get too geeky beyond that with our audience here. But if, in fact, over the next 6 months, we do not see a jump in general inflation, then I'm optimistic on meat demand. And I think the odds of that are a little better than 50-50, but certainly not 95%.
And Glenn, you had another report you wanted to mention from the Meat Demand Monitor. Yeah,
so I have the privilege of working with a lot of great students, and Justin Bina is one of them. Justin led and helped me kick out a special report using Meat Demand Monitor data here, primarily for 2023, looking at the interaction or the relationship between protein consumption and your physical fitness. So how active you are, do you have goals for weightlifting and ongoing anaerobic exercise and so forth, and a couple of nuggets that are in there. And again, you pull the full report up on our AgManager website. Is over a third people say yes to the following question. Do you intentionally eat protein to aid in meeting strength training or other fitness-related goals? The relevance of that over a third saying yes is they are way more likely to include beef or pork in their meals yesterday. Specifically, if you said yes to that, you had 0.86 meals yesterday that included beef. So we asked if you had beef in your breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So less, not quite 1 meal a day if you said yes, but it's 0.6 meals, so a lot closer to half a meal a day if you said no. And I know that sounds like silly small numbers, but remember, we're a country of over 300 million people. So scale these things up, it's a really big deal. Pork is 0.56 if you say yes, so a little over half a meal yesterday that included pork if you said yes to that protein question or intentionality of protein consumption. And it's less than half. It's 0.45 if you said no. And we geek out on that a lot more than that in the report. There's regional patterns. The western states and the southern states are more likely to say this is an intentional part of why they buy protein. All else equal, if you're younger, it's more there. And actually, it's more likely in most age cohorts for males than females. So all of that helps us further understand what's the role of some growing interest in personal fitness goals. COVID magnified that. It's already kind of there, but it ramped it up. And I think it's important for the beef and pork industries to track that. Justin's special report using MDM data gives us another fresh look at that. My last shout out there, I'm purposely using his name because I want to give him credit for this, but his dissertation is underway over the next 6, 9, maybe 12 months. We're going to get a lot more detail on this topic using not just MDM data, but some other broader federal data sets at the end of the day to help the stakeholders understand that what's the role of personal fitness and goals on meat demand.
As many things end up on AgManager.info, there's been a few K-State research and extension events, and one of them recently was the Risk and Profit Conference. And if people missed it, are they able to find some of that information from that event on the website?
Yeah, our Risk and Profit event was recent, and there's other competing events, the Governor's Summit and so forth going on. And, I know that led to some not being able to attend is the main reason for this call out. So the presentation slides are available on our Ag Manager website. At some point, we'll actually get recordings of several of those sessions. Recordings and slides from past years are there as well. Or, attendees or those that have thought about attending but have never made it in the past, I encourage them to make use of that resource. And then looking forward here, at the end of the month is a bit of a road show here. So Ag Lenders Conference in our department will go out to Garden City on Tuesday the 20th. I believe it's Tuesday, September 26th. And the 27th is back here in Manhattan, Kansas. And the very next day is Dale Blasey and his team host the KSU Stocker Field Day, which is always a great event for that segment that doesn't get as much attention in the industry. So regardless of where you sit in the cattle industry, you'll have opportunities to hear from us, either recordings in the past or here in a couple of weeks in person. Please take advantage of those opportunities.
Glynn, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our cattle market update.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, and go Cats.
That was K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. I will link the resources that he mentioned in today's show notes. Also in today's show notes will be a link to research that undergraduate students in the Department of Communications and Agricultural Education at Kansas State University are conducting. They're conducting research on the demographics and preferences of Ag Today listeners. Participation from every listener is voluntary and should take less than 5 minutes. The survey will close September 15th. You can find all of these links to these resources in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show now with a conversation for growers of wheat and variety selection. And in to talk about it, we have K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato. Romulo, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Shelby. Thank you. It's great to be here one more time with you.
As growers might be thinking about what variety of wheat they're going to select, a study that's recently you've worked on is Dual Purpose the Wheat Variety Performance.
Wheat variety selection is a whole topic in itself, right? There's many things that we can talk about when it comes to wheat variety selection. And that will depend on the grower's location first, so where they are positioned in terms of their field, and also what's the cropping system that they have there, if they're planting directly wheat on wheat or wheat on soybeans, or out in the West, if they're going after a fallow period or after corn, and really in-season management decisions take into account as well. For example, are they willing to put out a foliar fungicide? And if yes, then they might have many varieties to choose from, whether, if not, that will restrict based on variety disease tolerance, right? So there are many things that can be considered when a grower is selecting a wheat variety to go in their fields. Now, through K-State, we have a few different publications, right, that can help growers make that selection. And as you very well pointed out, this recent one that we just put out is a Dual Purpose Wheat Variety Performance 2023. So what is dual purpose? Well, dual purpose is a wheat crop that is planted for not only grain production, but also for cattle grazing, right? So it's a crop that is planted earlier than what a normal wheat crop for grain only would have been, typically planted at a higher seeding rate as well, because growers want to maximize their forage production in the fall and through the winter, graze that crop through the fall and winter, and then terminate that grazing with enough time that the crop can still recover and produce grain yield, right? So that's a great thing about wheat, the flexibility that it provides to grower. And in Kansas, anywhere from 10 to 15% of the crop is grazed every year in terms of this dual purpose production, mostly south central and southwest part of the state. And we get into heavier grazing situations as we go to Oklahoma, maybe 50, 60% of the state may be grazed, and Texas as well. So this specific publication is targeting those growers, right, that are wanting to select a wheat variety for those dual purpose systems. How does that differ from a grain-only system when the grower is looking for a variety? There's a few different traits, right, that the grower may be interested here. One of them is how much forage yield can each variety put out in the fall, right? Because that will impact directly how much gain the cattle is going to have as well, just the amount of how much forage will be produced. Is there differences among the varieties? Absolutely. Some varieties are high producing forage varieties, others are lower, even though the biggest driver of fall production forage is weather and fertility, right? So a warm fall with enough moisture and fertility might result in 4,000 pounds of forage dry matter produced in the fall by wheat crop, whereas a dry fall may reduce that to 500. And so the biggest driver is still weather and fertility. After that, variety still plays a role there. But another thing that variety may be more important is date of first hollow stem. So the date of first hollow stem is, again, out there in the spring after the crop went through the vernalization process. How soon does the variety start the reproductive development? And those very tiny developing heads are actually reaching the soil surface, right? They start being developed in the crown of the crop, and they start being pushed upwards in that stem. So first hollow stem is when are they reaching the soil surface? Why is that important in dual-purpose systems? Well, that's the exact date when we want to finish our grazing. Because if the cattle is grazing past the first hollow stem, we start to have very steep yield losses. It may be anywhere from 1 to 5% per day in terms of yield losses, depending on weather conditions, right? If you have a very harsh weather after grazing termination there, it may be closer to the 5% per day. And finally, a third factor that we consider in varieties when we're looking at dual-purpose systems is the recovery potential from that stress that is the grazing, right? There's grazing and trampling and everything that goes on when cattle is grazing that variety, so forage removal, trampling of plants, etc. So how tough is the variety in terms of bouncing back from that stress? There are other things that these growers may also consider as well. If we're planting early, they might want resistance to even viral diseases. Also, high temperature germination sensitivity is another thing. Coleoptile length, and tolerance to acid soils. So all of these things, they're important in dual-purpose systems because, for example, acid soils, they're going to impact more forage production of wheat than it will grain yield. So wheat forage is more sensitive to low soil pH than wheat grain yield. In this specific publication, which is called Dual-Purpose Wheat Variety Performance 2023, what we do here is we measure 3 out of those important traits: fall forage yield, date of first hollow stem, and grazing recovery potential of a range of different winter wheat varieties that are exposed to all of the different management that would have here, either grain only or dual purpose as well.
Are there any key points that you wanted to point out from the different varieties?
Absolutely. So this last year, right, fall forage yield was actually fairly low. As I mentioned, weather is the major driver. And actually, the average fall forage production for the entire trial was short of 500 pounds of dry matter per acre. That's very low. Now, we had varieties that yielded as close to 700, which is almost double than the average. So there was some varieties that differed in terms of their fall forage potential. And those varieties are outlined there in that publication. In terms of first hollow stem, we have a very strong year effect on there as well. For example, if we have a year where we have a warm winter with good moisture, some of these varieties may start as early as mid-March to reach that first hollow stem and run through early April. Now, last year, because we had such a cool winter and a dry winter that ran pretty long, we're really looking at early April for most of the varieties. It was just being held back by that drought and cold. And so I think that we didn't have more than about 7 days difference in first hollow stem among those varieties. So a very short interval there in first hollow stem. The way that we're running these trials is we have 3 neighboring trials. 2 of those trials, they are planted early, so mid-September roughly. And those 2 trials are managed under dual purpose, right? Higher seeding rate, enough nitrogen for fall production. And we're going there and sampling for. One of these trials is a destructive trial where we sample forage and we sample first hollow stem many times in the season. The next trial, we go there only for grain yield, and we do a simulated grazing on it where we're actually removing all of that biomass pretty much on a weekly basis there throughout the winter and spring. And the third trial is planted at the optimum time, and it's planted at a little bit lower population as well. And it receives nitrogen for grain, but not for forage, right? And so then we compare. And this year, the difference in grain yield between the trial managing grain only and dual purpose was roughly just around 2 to 3 bushels per acre or so. Of course, with the advantage for the grain only trial as compared to the dual purpose trial. So not a lot of difference there, but some varieties had as much as close to 8 bushels per acre yield loss due to that dual-purpose system. Some of them were around at 0 or even some positive. Can happen where we can even improve the yield sometimes on these varieties. And why would we improve the yield with a dual-purpose management? Well, that stress of removing the forage, it will actually delay variety maturity. And with the delayed maturity, we can perhaps escape some freeze damage early in the spring, or in a year like we had last year, where overall that year favored later maturing varieties. And so some of these varieties where we see perhaps a gain from the dual purpose, it may have been an early maturing variety that delayed its maturity some, and it was able to benefit from the slightly later maturity that was imposed by the grazing stress. Again, all of this information, including each variety yield under granola and under dual purpose, it is provided in this publication, MF3312. Again, it's MF3312 through K-State Bookstore, and producers can just download it directly online.
Romulo, you mentioned coleoptile length. Why might that be important for producers to take into consideration?
Yeah, so coleoptile is that very first protective structure that comes out of the seed. Right? As we plant the seed under the ground, the first protective structure is going to make its way into the soil surface. Once it reaches light, then it will produce the first true leaf is going to come through the coleoptile. So it's very important that the coleoptile is long enough to reach the surface. That becomes even more important under a couple of circumstances here. First, when there's no moisture available on the surface and producers are trying to plant deep and reach for moisture, they need varieties with long coleoptile. Second, if they're planting early, and soils are hot, the hot soils, they tend to reduce coleoptile length in some varieties. And so if we're planting early in hot soils, it's very important that we plant a variety with long coleoptile as well. So coleoptile, extremely important to ensure that we have a good stand establishment in our wheat crop. Every single variety that comes through the variety trials at K-State, we measured in the laboratory their coleoptile length. And after we measure all of them, these 40 coleoptile, then we kind of rank them from the shortest to the longest. And the shortest coleoptile that we had was just about 1 3/4 inches long, whereas the longest coleoptile was 3 3/8 inches. So again, this is publication MF3612. MF3612 through K-State Bookstore. Growers are, if they're considering different varieties and they are in doubt which one to choose because other agronomics are similar, I'll make sure and check their coleoptile length to make sure that you are not going to plant deeper than you should for a given variety.
That was K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato. I will link the resources that he mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. We finish our Monday show with some information from the Wildlife Department. And this week, we're joined with K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist, Joe Gerken. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back.
Joe, you mentioned that you've been getting a lot of questions about low water and dry ponds.
Yeah, so as we know, we're dry throughout the state. We've started to get a little bit of water in some places, but those water tables are still really low. So a lot of the ponds throughout the state are still really low. When it's hot temperatures we've had combined with low water, there's been some concerns about livestock water quality, so I thought we would just chat about that for a few minutes today.
Talking about the livestock, is that water, when it is that low, still safe for livestock?
Yeah, I get a lot of calls saying, is my water safe for the cattle? And that's a hard question to answer because it's not really a yes or no question, right? It's a sliding scale. And so water might be safe, but it might not be the best, right? So I might be able to hand you a glass of water straight out of the river, but you might not want to drink that. If you get thirsty enough, you will drink it, but there might be some concerns. Having some water in that situation is better than no water. So it's not really a yes or no answer. It's kind of a sliding scale. Generally, the water is safe throughout the state, but there might be times when you need to bring it in. So some of the concerns you might have are, was there some sort of contaminant added to that water? A lot of people see dead fish this time of year. Oxygen levels can really stress the fish. So a dead fish doesn't necessarily mean that all the water is not safe, but it might be something to think about. So adding cattle to the pond too can further cause some problems with water quality.
Joe, what are some of those concerns with the water quality?
So some of the things with water quality might include we're taking cows and we're really concentrating them in a small area. And so if we have more cows in a smaller area, we might increase nutrients. They might stomp the bottom of the pond more and release some of the sediment into the pond. You might have increased fecal contamination. So all of those things kind of combine, and when we see low water, we might start to have some concerns with the water quality itself.
Talking about cattle, them consuming water is especially important right now as we have warmer temperatures.
An average cow drinks about 15 to 20 gallons of water a day. A lactating cow is probably closer to 30 gallons, and that might be even higher with the temperatures that we've seen lately. Having access to clean, high-quality water is really important for the cattle, their health, and their growth, and so that's something we want to definitely monitor.
So if there are water quality concerns for your cattle, maybe haul some water in.
That's always the safe bet. I mean, I know it's a lot of work to haul that water in, but if you're concerned, haul that water in, reach out to your local extension agent and see if they can do a site visit or invite me out for a site visit. We can test that water and make sure that it's safe for those cattle or any livestock.
There are some opportunities when there's low water in ponds.
Sure. One of the benefits of having these low ponds, an average pond in Kansas has a life cycle of about 15 to 20 years. And so that seems like a long time when you're starting out with a pond, but a vast majority of the ponds that I visit are well past that. Some people have had a pond that Grandpa had and it hasn't been touched in 50, 60, even more years. And so going out and working on your pond, cleaning out your pond, a lot of nutrients can be held in the bottom of the pond in the sediment. So getting those out of the watershed, not just digging them out and putting them on the bank, but putting them on the back side of the dam or taking them out to a field out of the watershed is important for getting rid of some of those nutrients. That can help limit excessive vegetation or plant growth. So some benefits there. Another thing that happens with older ponds is that the slope of the edge of the pond tends to get really shallow. So the pond kind of fills in over time. We want a nice 3-to-1 slope that allows for the proper amount of vegetation to grow. Also, if the cattle are accessing the pond, it kind of keeps it at a safe slope for them. So there are better options than letting the cattle go into the pond, but that's not always possible.
If people are worried about the quality of their water, is there someplace they could send some samples?
Two things. I think reaching out to your local extension agent is a great place to start. They can send a water sample to me or to VetMed at K-State, depending on what's being tested, and we can sample the water there. Another thing I'd recommend is doing a sediment sample. So taking some of the exposed bottom of the pond that's probably dry right now and might not normally be, send that off. You can get some testing on nutrient levels or compaction types of soil that are there. That's really good information to help you know whether you need to take some action with your pond or if it has some life left in it.
That was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.